Dakota Territory, 1,889. The early winter wind howled across the barren prairies as locals began gathering at the edge of old widow Hannah Merrow's ranch, someone everyone figured was far too old to be building anything on her own. Snow crunched under their boots as they stood watching in a mix of confusion and amusement. What stood before them wasn't a new livestock barn or a cabin like everyone else built, but a strange structure no one had ever seen, a low barn with thick walls, topped by the frame of a log cabin that Hannah herself was hauling beams up to place right on its roof. She was 62, frail and living alone since her husband died the previous winter. Yet those weathered hands kept stubbornly tying ropes, dragging timber, wedging beams, as if time and bitter cold couldn't break her will. Neighbors started whispering, some bursting out laughing. They said old Hannah must have gone senile, that no sane person would build a cabin right on top of a barn roof where heat and livestock smells would rise up, that at her age, one strong gust could send her slipping and she'd never get back up. Settlers all across Dakota were used to keeping cabins and barns separate, clean houses for people, distant sheds for animals. That was the standard everyone swore by. But the old widow quietly spent weeks on her backwards project, while other ranches had long finished their cabins before the cold set in and were now stacking huge piles of firewood for the long winter ahead. They mocked her, but still stood watching, like witnessing something bizarre heading straight for failure. Then winter arrived earlier than expected, bringing knife-sharp, cold, and long snow-filled nights. No one guessed that this very winter would be the harshest test, challenging every cabin, roof, and every family on the frontier. And Hannah's little house atop the barn, the one that seemed downright crazy, would work in a way no one yet understood. In a world of men dead certain of their own experience, an old widow saw what no one else bothered to notice. Autumn 1889 swept in with colder winds earlier than usual, whipping across the Dakota plains like a warning that winter would show no mercy. While other ranches hurried to seal cabin cracks and stack firewood waist-high for the skin-cutting months ahead, 2-year-old widow Hannah Merrow kept laboring over the foundation of a project that had the whole area buzzing. Each frosty morning she hunched over, dragging pine logs to the barn site. Each evening, with her breath visible under lamplight, she patiently measured oak beams and wedged stones with meticulous care, as if age only slowed her steps but couldn't dim her resolve. Neighbors figured she'd lost her mind. To them, there was no reason for an old woman to build a 12-foot-high livestock barn with pine walls packed tight with rammed earth, then set a cabin right on top like some unnecessary and dangerous second story. Grant Wilford, who lived half a mile away, often rode over in the afternoons to check on the progress of that odd contraption. He'd point at the rising thick walls and say, "Hannah, you're gambling with your life. You should have built a regular cabin back in May so you'd be ready for winter. That thing you call a house will collapse the moment the north wind hits." But Hannah just gave a slight nod, no arguing, no defending herself, then went back to packing more rammed earth into the log gaps. She'd lived over 6 decades on this harsh land, and knew full well that real cold waited for no one. It was ruthless as a wild beast, ready to slice through clothes and walls if you didn't know how to fight it. She'd seen plenty of solidly built cabins, still freeze solid from wind infiltration, families burning firewood all night just to survive a few hours. So instead of following habit, she chose to rely on natural principles, using heat from the livestock to warm the living space above. Her barn was unlike any around the area. Thick pine walls packed with rammed earth formed a solid mass that blocked wind and retained heat. Many called it an outdated method only old Europeans remembered, but that very outdated approach was the foundation of her entire design. Atop that heavy base she laid massive oak beams, each one heavy enough that 2 strong men would struggle to lift, yet she hauled them with an ox cart and maneuvered them into place alone. At the joints she wedged rough river stones her late husband had collected years before. It was an old technique from Europe's mountains, where stone reduced vibration, stabilized weight, and kept frames from twisting in high winds. Watching her, Grant Wilford could only shake his head. That's enough stone for 3 barns. Why make it so hard on yourself? But curiosity kept him staying to watch every step. Once the beams were set, she started on the cabin. Thick pine planks were fitted close, but she deliberately left small gaps that outsiders mistook for sloppy work, yet those gaps were the heart of the design. She allowed warm air from the barn below to rise naturally, passing through the floor and circulating throughout the cabin via convection. Her 8 cows, strong and cold-hardy, each produced about 5,000 BTUs of heat per hour. Together, that 40,000 BTUs became a steady, constant, completely free heating source. In her journal, she wrote, "They burn wood to survive the night. I use cows as my furnace." To keep the cabin free of odors or dampness, she built a simple but effective cross-flow ventilation system. A low intake pipe in the barn drew in cold air, which the animals warmed before it rose into the cabin through floor gaps. A small exhaust vent near the cabin roof pulled out stale air, keeping everything fresh. Neighbors saw only oddity, but they didn't grasp that this was exactly how ancient European bank barns had worked for centuries in the coldest mountain regions. Fearing north winds, she made the cabin roof lower than usual to reduce the air volume needing heat and added deep eaves to block sideways gusts. Cabin walls were double-layered pine. Between them, she packed forest moss, wood fibers, and dry clay for natural insulation that old-timers in Dakota still trusted. Every layer, every beam, every vent gap was arranged like an equation only she understood. She knew heat always rises, that animals provide not just milk and draft power but priceless winter warmth, that a warm floor can save a life from freezing death. All of it she noted in shaky handwriting in her old ledger. Heat rises. Animals warm the earth beneath them. A warm floor means survival. No one in the area paid attention to such reasoning. They just saw an old woman climbing oak beams with dirt-stained, trembling hands, swaying with each gust. And that sight only made them laugh louder. Even if she finishes it, that thing will freeze solid like every other cabin. They spoke as if it were undeniable truth. But what they didn't know was that her simple, though rough design was so precise that modern science decades later would describe it in detail. The house over barn they ridiculed was gradually becoming a natural thermodynamic machine, waiting for the winter ahead to prove its worth. And Hannah, despite her age and the scorn, kept steadily completing it. Because to her, it wasn't an experiment. It was her only survival plan for that winter. When November arrived, the first serious cold blanketed the Dakota plains, and Hannah Marrow knew this was only the prelude. Winter winds came early, shrieking through wooden walls like metal scraping stone, carrying bone-piercing cold she'd tasted her whole life on the frontier. While most neighbors remained confident they'd prepared enough 10 to 12 cords of firewood stacked high, cabin cracks sealed with clay and straw, livestock sheds patched with whatever scrap tin or boards they could find, Hannah quietly watched the ground freeze and the sun set. To them, it was enough to get through the cold. But to her, who'd survived many deadly winters, the only thought was, real cold isn't like the cold people talk about. The first blizzard hit mid-month, sudden and fiercer than anyone predicted. Temperatures plunged to 35 degrees Fahrenheit in hours, winds hurling huge sheets of snow against cabin walls like someone throwing white rocks. By dawn, 8 inches of snow blocked every door, and across the silent prairie the scene looked like a grim painting of endurance. In the Burwell house, smoke backed down the chimney shortly after lighting the fire. The family coughed desperately, forced to crack the door for air, but one gust nearly extinguished the stove. The Harpers' home was worse chaos. A wash basin on the stove froze over despite roaring flames. Their youngest child cried from purple toes, while the parents frantically tried resealing wall gaps blowing open in the wind. In many cabins across the area, children slept bundled under layers of blankets and buffalo hides, yet cold still pierced the fabric as if seeking skin. Fires burned constantly. Firewood consumed faster than it could be split, and shadows rushing to and from woodpiles in the storm became a familiar nighttime sight. Amid that scene, Hannah's house barn stood remarkably steady. Winds howled over the barn roof, thudding against thick walls like war drums, but the cabin above didn't sway. The old oak beams she'd placed over many days and nights kept the whole structure so stable that her oil lamp flame stayed perfectly still, unlike the flickering lights in neighbors' homes. She walked her small room barefoot, feeling steady warmth rise from the floor. Not blazing hot, but enduring like an invisible current breathing rhythmically. Her 8 cows below, settled into winter routine, gave off constant heat that rose through the floor gaps she'd planned from the start. Warm air flowed through the cabin like water, never stalling or reversing despite outside winds. It blended naturally as if the cabin were warmed by the earth's own breath. When the storm paused briefly, Grant Wilford, the one who'd mocked her most, stood at a distance, shielding his face from wind, staring at the soft yellow light from her window. He muttered, half amazed, half disbelieving, "That foolish old woman's house barn. It actually seems to work." But right after, he and the other men reassured themselves it was just temporary luck. Any cabin could survive an early snow if the weather wasn't as bad as feared. They couldn't accept that an old widow, someone they saw as weak and outdated, understood the cold deeper than they did. Men who'd been so sure they knew exactly how the Dakota frontier worked. But November was only beginning, and the horizon already gathered heavy leaden clouds, a sign of the real storm to come, one that would allow no one to rely on luck anymore. Hannah knew it before anyone else. Word of Hannah's strange building spread faster than the early winter winds, slipping over hills and along dirt roads into Cedar Hollow. Just days after the first snow, the tale of the old lady building a house on a barn reached ranches, 3, even 5 miles away. Families who'd never met Hannah repeated it confidently, as if they'd seen it themselves. "Old Hannah's putting up a barn tower." They'd laugh. "She'll freeze solid before Christmas." The words carried no outright malice, but dripped with condescension and scorn. This frontier never lacked judgment for anything deemed unusual. At church on Sundays, where local women gathered around the stove swapping news, the story grew even more embroidered. They whispered while glancing out windows toward her ranch. "Sleeping right over cows? Not clean at all." Another clucked. "An old widow building that thing alone? What if she falls, who'll care for her?" A few showed faint pity, thinking she'd been too lonely too long, but most just viewed it with skeptical judgment. The men saw Hannah building her own cabin as an insult to proper technique. They'd grown up believing cabin building was men's work, women only handling indoor chores. So seeing her perched precariously on oak beams, measuring planks with veined, skinny hands, they roared with laughter. Standing 50 yards away with arms folded, they watched like a poorly performed show. "She's setting those beams all wrong." Another added, "One more gust, and that thing comes crashing down." They were certain her cabin would sway in high winds, reek of livestock, or worst roof crack, and collapse right on her during a storm night. That certainty came not from knowledge but long habit, believing their experience was the only standard. Local kids copied the adults, running past her fence yelling like it was a game. "Cow Castle. There goes the barnhouse lady." Their laughter echoed with small footsteps kicking up white snow sprays. Hannah heard it all but just stood watching calmly, not angry, only gently weary, as if those words no longer reached her. All her life, she'd been doubted. Poor when young, childless, widowed early. She'd been seen as not strong enough, not smart enough, not fit for frontier life. Her silence now wasn't the resignation people mistook it for, but a calm from knowing her own worth and knowing what they did not. That evening, under dim oil lamp glow, she opened her late husband's old journal and added a few lines. "They fear what they don't understand. But I've seen how real cold takes lives." Then she closed the book, sighing softly like a prayer for those who still believed Dakota winter was just stories they'd heard. People still chuckled passing her ranch, but that's when the warm floor mechanism inside Hannah's cabin began working exactly as she'd calculated. To understand why the structure succeeded, look at the basic thermodynamics she, an old widow, grasped better than most men around. When livestock breathe, chew, move, their bodies generate constant heat. That heat is substantial and, crucially, steady regardless of outside wind strength. Warmer air is lighter, so it naturally rises by convection, collecting at the barn ceiling below. Hannah had heard her late husband describe loft barns in Pennsylvania, colonial-era 2-level barns that accidentally created astonishing heat retention. After he died, that memory became her only trust. Heat always rises. So she built the cabin directly above the barn, not out of eccentricity, but from correctly applying natural law. Her cabin floor consisted of 3 layers, designed simply yet remarkably. The first was load-bearing oak beams, hardest wood in Dakota, enduring long, wet winters. The second was a deliberate 3-inch gap. Warm air rising from the barn circulated here, forming a natural heat cushion like underground heating ducts. The third was thick pine planks sealed with linseed oil against moisture and rot. The result, Even at 35 degrees Fahrenheit outside, her floor stayed 48-55 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to block foot-chilling cold and keep the cabin comfortably livable. Many assumed barn air would carry odors, but Hannah solved that with her carefully calculated cross-flow ventilation. She placed a fresh air intake on the north side, never sun-warmed, for consistently cold, clean inflow. The exhaust vent near the cabin roof drew out the hottest stale air, carrying excess moisture while routing filtered, warm, clean air into living space. Thus the cabin stayed odor-free, dry, and evenly ventilated. An uneducated old widow had designed something nearly identical to modern airflow modeling. Cabin walls followed the same rough but effective principle. She packed moss, clay, and wood fibers into log gaps, creating natural insulation superior to neighbors' cheap mortar or cement chinking. Her double walls reduced heat loss by 40–50%. What many dismissed as backward was actually performance later acknowledged by science. The low, deep roof wasn't for looks, but to minimize air volume. Needing warmth, low ceiling prevented cold air pooling. Long eaves blocked northwest winds, Dakota's coldest direction. From afar, her cabin looked small, but it was precisely sized for merciless winter. Compared to neighbors' traditional cabins, the difference was stark. Standard cabins had tightly locked floors, letting ground cold rise, wind sneaking through, cracked chinking. Families entirely dependent on stoves. Even burning wood all night left dead cold corners where water froze in bowls. Meanwhile, Hannah's cabin barely needed nighttime fire. No cold corners, no chilling drafts underfoot, and she saved 60–70% on firewood compared to others. It wasn't magic. It was technique applied precisely, detail by detail. Seeing thick black smoke still pouring from their chimneys while hers only gently released warmth from eaves, a few began wondering. But instead of admitting it, they just dialed back the mockery a notch, replacing it with doubt. Maybe the old lady just got lucky. Another smirked. Wait till the real cold hits, see if that thing still stands. They still laughed. But now the laughter carried a thin streak of unease, the unease of realizing what they'd called foolish might force them to rethink their entire way of surviving Dakota winters. Occasionally, when stepping out onto the cabin porch to dump stove ashes, Hannah would look up at the sky and notice signs from nature that others ignored. Lead gray skies lingering unchanged for days, buffalo herds to the north, migrating earlier than usual in a silent flow, signaling something unusual. Wolves, rarely seen near ranches, now appearing right at the wooden fence, with golden eyes gleaming in the cold night. Migratory birds leaving in a hurry, before the timing she'd known over 6 decades on the frontier. All of it pointed to one thing. This winter would be unlike any before. In Cedar Hollow, everyone heard the rumors, but interpreted them in the way of people long reliant on their own strength. They chopped extra firewood, stacking it nearly to the eaves. Men patched roof boards with fresh strips. Women gathered more dried beans, salted meat, winter turnips, preparing for a predicted long cold season. Still, they relied on ancestral experience. We've made it through so many years, we'll do it this year too. Worry crept in, but wasn't enough to make them question their own methods. In contrast, Hannah, the one called the crazy old widow, checked her system with the focus of someone who knew a single small mistake could mean life or death. She inspected each vent, cupping her hand to feel the gentle airflow, and confirmed convection was working correctly. She resealed roof gaps with moss and clay mix to block drafts. Down in the barn, she replaced straw bedding for the cows, adding another calculated heat-retaining layer. Heading back up, she opened her journal and wrote a short line. If this design is right, I won't have to fear the cold ever again. It wasn't self-reassurance, but a quiet vow that she'd bet correctly on her husband's knowledge and on natural laws that never lied. The first blizzard hit at the end of the week. Snow filling the sky, but not yet at its worst. Cabin roofs in the village started showing ice streaks in corners, signs of heat loss. A few families already had to build bigger fires. Firewood burning faster than planned. Wind whistled through cracked chinking, forcing children to huddle for warmth while adults' breath turned to thick white clouds in kitchens. But at the small ranch at the valley's end, Hannah's cabin atop the barn maintained a steady temperature around 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The wooden floor beneath her feet warmed in gentle waves, as if an endless underground furnace lay below. While oil lamps flickered in neighbors' homes from drafts, The light in her cabin stayed steady, yellow stability, not from luck, but from every detail she'd built with the trembling hands of an old widow who understood that Dakota winter never spared those who underestimated it. The second blizzard struck just days later, giving no one in Cedar Hollow time to catch their breath. This time, the fury hit the valley head-on like a wild beast, unleashing its full power on the frontier. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, winds gusting to 55 miles per hour, dragging swirling snow curtains that erased nearly all visibility. People said in those hours you couldn't tell ground from sky, just a churning white that swallowed everything. At the storm's peak, the Harper family's cabin suffered the first disaster. Wall chinking began peeling away in chunks, creating large gaps where wind sliced in like cold blades against skin. The stove overloaded, flames roared red, then shot sparks onto the wooden floor, nearly igniting the rug below. The Harpers' youngest child shivered violently despite 3 thick blankets, while the mother tried shielding the child's back from drafts, tears streaming from the biting cold. They couldn't seal the door, couldn't stay warm, and could only pray the storm would pass soon. At the Burwells, tragedy took another form. They ran out of firewood. Barely 10 days into the deep freeze, Mr. Burwell had burned 7 cords amounts that lasted a month in past winters. In desperation, he chopped fence posts, then wooden chairs, even dismantling part of the kitchen rack for fuel. Thick smoke backed into the cabin, making the father cough violently until he collapsed to the floor, while his wife had to open the door in the storm for ventilation, a dangerous move with no alternative. Cold rushed in instantly, shocking the family into huddling tighter. Then the Callahans' home, where tragedy struck in heartbreaking silence. Their 6-year-old daughter, weaker than her siblings, began losing feeling in her feet. It started as numbness, then skin turned purple, and finally the child couldn't stand. The mother frantically hugged her, rubbing the tiny feet in vain, sobbing and calling the child's name as if her voice could drive away the frost. But the harsh truth was, their cabin wasn't warm enough, sealed enough, or strong enough against a winter that terrified even the hardiest local hunters. Those were moments when the line between life and death narrowed terrifyingly, and any family in the area could be next. Amid that numbing cold, the contrast stood out sharply, like a cut splitting the sky in two. From afar, Hannah's cabin glowed soft yellow through the thick white veil. No roaring firelight like other homes, just the quiet steadiness of an oil lamp and even warmth radiating inside. Chimney smoke rose thin and light, a sign the stove wasn't overloaded. No black streaks, no thick plumes, everything ran just right. Beneath that cabin floor, livestock heat rose steadily like clockwork, keeping the whole house at a temperature anyone in the valley would trade half their firewood to feel. While neighbors fought desperately against bone-piercing cold, the old widow's foolish house stood firm like a wordless rebuttal, proof that sometimes the things mocked are the only ones built correctly. That night, what Cedar Hollow folks would forever call the skin-cutting night of 1889, the final storm slammed the valley with force even the oldest hunters had never seen. Winds screamed like metal dragged over bone, swirling gusts, whipping snow sideways like ice blades slicing the air. Snow hammered other cabins' walls like gravel hurled with full strength. Wood groaned and cracked under wind and cold pressure, each sound a warning that one more blast could rip walls open. In that blinding white gale, Hannah's cabin held its remarkably steady stance. Inside, the floor maintained 56 degrees Fahrenheit, warmth rising gently in waves like the land's steady breath beneath her. She lit only a small stove fire, just enough for thin corn porridge supper, not from thrift, but because she didn't need more. The cows below, though huddled against the howling, still gave off living heat that kept air under the floor warm and moving exactly as planned. The table oil lamp glowed, soft yellow light on her wrinkled yet calm face, creating a strangely contrasting scene to the torn world outside. In that quiet, her mind drifted to old memories, her husband by the fire, rubbing cracked hands and saying in his warm, low voice, "Warmth from the ground is true warmth. It doesn't betray." She closed her eyes briefly, whispering a small prayer, not for herself but for the homes struggling out there against cold, overwhelming all life. Through the howling, she began hearing other sounds, faint but piercing the storm. Prolonged coughing from someone exhausted, children's sobs shredded by wind, then doors banging repeatedly as if occupants couldn't seal them anymore. Surrounding homes were gradually losing heat retention. Families wrestled despair as frost poured through every crack. Near midnight, winds grew fiercer, and Hannah knew if the storm lasted till dawn, many valley cabins wouldn't hold. She placed her hand on the warm floor, feeling cow heat rise like gentle reassurance that at least here, where the whole village once saw a joke, remained a small light in the endless cold sea. On that skin-cutting night, when cold crept like a living creature through the valley seeking weakest spots to attack, the old widow's house over barn became the only place where warmth and calm remained intact. Amid winds screaming around the eaves and snow-pelting cabin walls like fistfuls of gravel, Hannah heard a sound unlike the storm, weak, intermittent knocking, as if the knocker might collapse right at the threshold. Opening the door, cold rushed in like a blade, and through the white blur stood the Burwell family, the father nearly buckling, the 3-year-old's lips purple, eyes dazed from cold. Mr. Burwell managed only broken words. We're out of wood. Then his arms dropped limp. Hannah took the child first, holding it close for warmth to spread, then guided the whole family inside without a word of reproach. Less than 10 minutes later, while handing hot porridge to the shaking Mrs. Burwell, another figure staggered to the door. It was the Harpers, faces crusted with thin ice from whipping wind. The mother clutched her 6-year-old tightly, the child's small feet bruised red then paling, each step trembling as if the ground might give way. Mr. Harper, face ashen from exhaustion, stood silent a moment, then gasped, We mocked you, and now we're freezing." No bitterness in his voice, only regret and a father's fear before cold taking his child's life. Hannah just nodded slightly, opened the door wider, and said softly, "Come in." Quickly, near night's end, as the storm peaked, the Callahans arrived last. They could barely stand. The father clutched the doorframe to stay upright, the mother holding 2 children while her whole body shook uncontrollably. Hannah stepped half out, pulling them in with her small but strong hands, then slammed the door as wind behind howled, trying to tear the roof off. Once closed, the difference between death and life shone clear as the oil lamp glow. Cabin warmth hit the newcomers' faces so strongly they gasped like escaping an abyss. The Harper child relaxed in her mother's arms as heat reached her feet. Mr. Burwell braced on his knees, head tilted as if struggling to believe the nightmare ended. Adults stared around, stunned. No big fire. No roaring red stove like they maintained all night. Yet air was warm, soft, enveloping them like an invisible blanket. One knelt, hand on the wooden floor, and startled at warmth rising into his palm like from a living furnace. "My God," he whispered, eyes wide in disbelief. Then, as natural for those long on despair's edge, tears fell, part amazement, part shame, but mostly relief knowing tonight they and their children would live. In the cabin, the whole valley had ridiculed. Warmth became the simple miracle saving those who'd laughed at it. Once everyone settled, gathered around the small oil lamp in that strangely warm cabin, Hannah quietly served porridge, added blankets, and let floor warmth do the rest. Finally, facing their wondering and astonished eyes, she spoke only the simple truth she'd believed all her life. Heat always rises. She placed her hand on the floor plank, touching the design's heart, and continued. Animals warm the ground they stand on. And finally, voice hoarse but firm, a warm floor saves more lives than any big fire. Those words sank the room into silence. Adults looked at each other, facing the painful truth. They'd been wrong from the start. They'd built cabins by handed-down habit, not physics, not nature observation, and certainly not what they'd mocked for months. They'd judged her by age and gender, believing an old widow couldn't know more than strong men laboring lifelong. But that skin-cutting night proved otherwise. An end-of-storm figures made the gap between pride and understanding clearer. The Burwells used nearly 20 cords of wood, the Harpers about 17, the Callahans over 15, forced to burn fences and furniture to continue. Yet Hannah used under 6 cords all winter, mostly just for cooking. Their cabins had 20 degrees Fahrenheit differences nightly between stove and room corners, creating dead cold zones risking child frostbite. Hers varied only 3–5 degrees Fahrenheit, floors staying evenly warm from natural convection below. It wasn't magic. It was simple science they'd refused to see because it came from someone they deemed weak. In that silence, one man who'd mocked her loudest last fall finally sighed, bowed his head, and said choked, "We thought you were weak, but turns out only you were strong enough to think differently." That admission rang like the final note closing Cedar Hollow's brutal winter and opening the truth that sometimes those seen as smallest see what whole communities miss. When spring finally melted the thick valley ice in Cedar Hollow, small streams ran down hillsides like washing away memories of the cruel winter past. But what couldn't wash away was the change in the community's hearts. Everyone who'd ridiculed Hannah, from men laughing from afar to wives gossiping at church, now visited her small ranch one by one. No one called her building the crazy house barn anymore. They brought notebooks, wood samples, asking about beam placement, floor gaps, convection flow. Some, for the first time in years, bowed to her and apologized. At church that week, before the whole community, they admitted the truth Winter taught harshly. They'd been wrong, and an old widow understood heat, life, nature more than they'd imagined. From those talks, the Marrow warm floor system was born, a name neighbors gave. Not Hannah. They recorded the design in drawings, sketching beam layout, heat distribution, vent placement, low roof for reduced loss. Soon, ranches within 5 to 7 miles adopted the model. New houses built over barns bore small notes on door beams, inspired by Hannah Marrow. Hannah never asked for it. They did it from respect for the one who'd saved them with what they'd mocked. Word spread so far that the Regional Agricultural College in Fargo, in its 1891 bulletin, noted heat from livestock loft systems as an advanced solution blending European tradition and local innovation. Though no one told her, her name appeared as a unique example of folk wisdom meeting experiment. But Hannah remained unaware. She lived quietly as before, tending cows, opening her journal nightly, and smiling gently, seeing neighbors' chimney smoke no longer thick black as past winters. The design's impact went beyond one winter's survival. Cutting firewood used 50–70%, poor families no longer struggling for every stick survived without selling livestock or belongings. Cold-related illnesses dropped sharply. Fewer children frostbitten. Fewer elders with pneumonia. No more dangerously roaring stoves. A movement of barn under cabin building spread across Minnesota and the Dakotas. Not by government mandate, but from life or death experience teaching. Warmth isn't something to waste. Meanwhile, Hannah stories became fireside tales each evening. Children spoke of Hannah with the house warm from below, eyes shining like fairy tales. Adults shared with respect. She got through the winter that nearly broke the whole valley. Though unspoken, all knew without her cabin upon barn, 1889 winter could have been Cedar Hollow's tragedy. One late spring afternoon, with wind carrying new grass scent and sun pouring golden light on melting fields, the scene at Hannah's ranch became unforgettable. The small cabin steady atop the barn, light warmth still escaping. Eves though weather warmed, Hannah leaning on her old rake, quietly gazing at fields and distant homes now warmer thanks to the knowledge she'd shared. No banners, no praise, just the peace of someone knowing she'd done right. And the ending, ringing like a simple philosophy passed through generations. They mocked her age, they mocked her ways. But when winter came, her wisdom kept the whole valley alive. If you enjoy survival stories full of historical wisdom like this, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes. Thank you for watching. See you on the next journey.